From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the issue of cross-border humanitarian aid into northern Syria. The UN Security Council is due to vote on the renewal of cross-border assistance before July 10th, and Russia is threatening to sever access altogether. More than 4.5 million civilians currently rely on that aid, and cutting it off will put their lives in jeopardy and could risk further instability, with potential ripple effects across the region. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got three great guests joining us in the program today: Charles Lister, Mona Yacoubian, and James Jeffrey. Charles is the director of MEI's Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs. Mona is the senior advisor to the vice president of Middle East and Africa at the United States Institute of Peace. Her work centers on conflict analysis and prevention in the Middle East, with a specific focus on Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Jim is the chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center and previously served as the U.S. ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, the special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, and the special representative for Syrian engagement. Charles, Mona, Jim, welcome to the program, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Charles, to start off with, can you give our listeners a quick overview of the situation? What's at stake, and why is this vote so critical?
Yeah, so good and a big question. Long story short, since 2014, the UN has had a mandate to provide cross-border assistance into non-regime held areas of Syria. Russia in the past couple years or 18 months has methodically reduced the number of those crossings using its veto power in the UN from 2 crossings in January 2020 to just 1 in July 2020. And then, as you said in your introduction, that final crossing at Bab al-Hawa into the northwest of Syria is up for a renewal vote in roughly 2 weeks' time. So far, Russia is clearly signaling an intent to vote no and to sever cross-border assistance altogether. Now, that is likely to be posturing. There's clearly a negotiation to be had, but the stakes are enormous. Every month for the last year, over 1,000 trucks have crossed the Bab al-Hawa crossing each month, serving over 2.5 million people who are vitally in need of humanitarian assistance. And at the same time, the alternative that Russia is presenting, cross-line assistance, i.e. internal assistance provided via the capital in Damascus, has seen 0 trucks arrive in northwestern Syria every month for the last year. So the alternative Russia is providing just simply doesn't add up. Even if it did add up, even if there was free access from Damascus, there's no way it would even reach 50% of the scale of the assistance that the UN provides cross-border. So we're really watching a potentially unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, within a small number of months if this aid is stopped altogether. Briefly, the Biden administration's approach so far has been pretty encouraging. Almost every senior official who could have a role in pressuring and negotiating this has played a role in the last couple months, but ultimately the devil is in the details and the negotiations themselves, which we've frankly got very little visibility into. For now, we're playing a bit of a waiting game for the next couple of weeks when the vote takes place.
Mona, building on what Charles said, what is the humanitarian situation in Idlib like right now, and what would happen were the Bab al-Hawa crossing to close?
Well, the humanitarian situation in Idlib right now is quite perilous. I mean, if we think about this humanitarian situation across Syria is really at its worst, the worst that it's been in the 10 years of the conflict. Idlib has a particularly vulnerable population because of the large number of internally displaced persons, or IDPs, who are now living in Idlib. There are anywhere from 3.5 to 4 million civilians living in Idlib today, and at least 3/4 of them are dependent on some sort of assistance. I mean, Charles has, I think, actually laid out quite well just how reliant this population is on life-saving assistance, on food, water, medical assistance coming across that UN border crossing. We also can't forget that, of course, we're in the midst of a pandemic, of a global pandemic. And so there are also issues related to COVID, and particularly, again, in a population that is living so close to one another. It's probably one of the most densely populated regions in the world, quite frankly. And so you're seeing in Idlib a very, very dire humanitarian situation. And I fully agree with Charles. If this sole remaining border crossing is closed, it would, without a doubt, precipitate a humanitarian catastrophe. UN officials have noted, again, as Charles has said, this 1,000 trucks that come each month providing assistance. There are 1.4 million Syrians living in Idlib who are reliant on food aid. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, noted this border crossing is a lifeline for 3.5 or 4 million civilians. So closing it would be disastrous.
Jim, where do the U.S. and Russia currently stand on this?
Well, we've just heard how sincere and determined the U.S. is to keep that crossing open, not only for humanitarian reasons, but Idlib basically represents the state of the ceasefire in all of Syria. It marks the high point of Assad's advances. He was defeated militarily. Therefore, it's not just humanitarian, it's also geostrategic. It also involves, of course, where these people would go if they don't have humanitarian support, which would be across the border into Turkey. So it's very important. Russia's position is that Assad's cross-line humanitarian programs would suffice to provide humanitarian assistance for these millions of people. But there has been no evidence whatsoever, and I have dealt with the Russians on Assad cross-line transfers of humanitarian goods on Rukban. It is not, to say the least, reliable. The UN has made that clear. NGOs have made that clear. Assad's strategy is to starve out anybody who's not under his control, not help them. So therefore, the Russians are basically asserting something that isn't real, but what they want is some kind of major American and Western concession in return for keeping that open. They see this as a tool to try to achieve their goal of a total win in Syria by ending the diplomatic isolation and the economic pressure on Assad. Whether the administration will go that far is an open question right now.
Charles, President Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin met recently in Geneva. Was there any headway made on this issue during their recent summit?
I mean, by minimal accounts that are available in public, it was raised by President Biden. Do we know if there was a response from the Russian side? No. It was minimally, if at all, discussed by Vladimir Putin in his press conference following the summit. So I assume what we probably saw was a statement of positions, and until now, largely a continuation of Russia's pushback. As I continue to hear from UN officials and from UN member states, the real nitty-gritty of the negotiations are going to be in New York. I assume that is what we will see take place, albeit behind the scenes, in the next couple of weeks. So no, my impression, at least, from the Biden-Putin summit is little of significance was likely discussed there, in large part because it was probably a little bit too early before the real hard negotiations get started.
Jim, as you referenced earlier, you've been involved in previous negotiations with Moscow over the issue of cross-border aid, and I wanted to kind of drill down on that a little bit more. How did those go, and what were the sort of carrots and sticks on the table?
We offered back in the Trump administration in January 2020, and then again in July 2020, when this both came up, no real concessions other than to emphasize the offer already on the table that was presented to President Putin by Mike Pompeo back in 2019, which was a step-by-step stand down of American and Western military, economic, and diplomatic pressure in return for real progress on the UN Resolution 2254, political compromise resolution of this conflict. And the Russians were not willing to go into that. Rather, what they demanded was one-sided American concessions, be it ending sanctions or many of the sanctions, be it allowing or even contributing to reconstruction, forcing refugees back. The Russians are obsessed with the need to get the 6 million refugees back into Syria to get the country going again. And we refused all of these, and basically we had a showdown. We lost in January, and 2 of the 4 crossings were closed, but we got a partial victory back in July, where Russia lost 6 UN Security Council votes in a week by large margins, and thus in the end agreed to keep the most important of the 2 remaining crossings, the Bab al-Hawa one we're talking about, open not for 6 months, which is what they agreed in December previously, but rather for a full year, which brings us to where we are now. So the Russians will drive a hard bargain, but if they feel themselves cornered, they at least may compromise and allow the crossing to stay open for additional time, but no one can be sure.
Mona, I'd like to get your thoughts here as well. What do you think it would take to get a deal done, and what leverage does the U.S. have, and what can it offer and threaten?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a deal to be made here, particularly if it's more narrowly defined and is not kind of in the grand bargain terms that Jim laid out, where they were negotiating a year or so ago, but rather if discussions center solely on the question of humanitarian access, which is really what this is about. I think we've sketched out pretty clearly how high the stakes are with respect to maintaining the border crossing. And so one could potentially envision a deal that in shorthand could be referred to as access for access, where in exchange for Russia maintaining the crossing by not vetoing the resolution when it comes up for a vote in July, the U.S. would acquiesce to promoting or allowing for more cross-line assistance. There are clear issues with cross-line, Charles alluded to, and we can talk about it. But I think the broad outlines of a deal in which both sides sort of give a bit in terms of how each other is viewing humanitarian access could be important. The other thing I think is important to note is, there have been discussions around the sanctions, and there's pretty complex thicket of sanctions currently in force on Syria. Those sanctions, and I'm referring specifically to the Caesar sanctions, those sanctions have humanitarian waivers embedded in them, but they're not often used well or taken advantage of. And there is a real issue around what's called overcompliance with sanctions. So the other question would be, are there some measures, is there something that can be done to address these issues around overcompliance and around the unintended humanitarian consequences of sanctions? So maybe some combination of those factors. One sort of factor in all of this that intrigues me is Turkey. And it's my sense that Turkey would not be happy with a Russian veto, because it would then bear a lot of responsibility for the humanitarian catastrophe that could unfold. It could be threatened by IDP flows either into other Turkish-controlled zones in northern Syria or even into Turkey, both of which would be a very poor scenario for Turkey. So I also wonder whether there is an implicit pressure on Russia not to veto in order to maintain the rather prickly partnership that it currently has with Turkey and Syria.
If I could just jump in and just sort of piggyback on some of those points that Mona made, I think, which are extremely important, but also intriguing. The Turkey point is, I think, crucial. I mean, Turkey has almost everything to lose by seeing the humanitarian situation across its border literally collapse. But interestingly, literally, late this week, and I realize this recording will come out a little bit after this, the pro-Assad forces have shelled 2 Turkish military posts in Idlib, and those were the first such incidents we've seen in months. And that also comes amidst a wider uptick in regime shelling of northwestern Syria. And it's kind of hard not to see this as not being a coincidence, but clearly having something to do with the fact that this humanitarian vote is coming up and all of the world's eyes, or at least some of the world's eyes, are newly on northwestern Syria again. So clearly that Turkey dynamic is both important, but also taking an intriguing escalation just in the last few days. And then on the sanctions point, I watched the UN Security Council session on Wednesday, and it was quite intriguing that the US ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, made a point to somewhat imply that the US was willing to see this as a conversation in which cross-line was part of the solution. And of course, it always kind of has been, but putting it that way was a new US language. And that was swiftly followed by comments from the Russian ambassador to the UN, who said that he quite appreciated the Biden administration's release of a number of additional qualifications to avoid overcompliance and unwarranted humanitarian effects of US sanctions. So it was quite intriguing to see both of those comments being made, admittedly, in amidst still very zero-sum rhetoric. But I think that to me clearly suggests that there is a negotiation being had.
If I could just jump in very quickly, the United States has consistently provided some humanitarian assistance to regime areas and certainly has not blocked anybody else doing that. So, certainly, there would be no objection to the United States allowing humanitarian assistance to flow cross line, assuming two things. One, it really did flow, and our experience as that of the UN has been absolutely negative in that regard. And two, that it doesn't flow with all kinds of conditions and caveats and other things, such as not going to areas where Hayat al-Sham is in charge, which is most of Idlib, for example. The devil is in the details here, not in the principle, but the details are very, very important in these negotiations.
Jim, I'd love to get your thoughts on the Turkey angle as well. Where does Ankara stand on this, and how does it fit into the kind of complicated relationship between Turkey and Russia?
Maintaining Idlib and thus maintaining the armed opposition is an essential, and maintaining the Turkish military presence in northwest and northeast Syria now is absolutely essential for Turkey's existential security concerns on its southern border with Syria. It wants to be at the table in any resolution of this conflict, and those are essentially the chips that it buys to get at the table. So that's important. Secondly, it really does fear that the 3.5 million people who are dependent upon assistance, if it doesn't flow to them, will flow across the border, doubling the number of refugees that Turkey is now taking care of. Turkey cannot support such a number of refugees. It would be a political crisis. So therefore, they are somewhat dependent upon either a renewal of the cross-border mandate or some kind of other arrangement, and that's hard with the Turks, with NGOs, to get assistance minus the UN assistance across the border to these people.
Mona, we've touched on the problems with relying on Damascus to deliver aid, the so-called cross-line assistance, but can you elaborate on that in a little bit more detail? What has been the experience when it comes to Damascus and aid delivery in the past?
Yeah, sure. I mean, unfortunately, the Assad regime has a long track record of weaponizing humanitarian access. We saw this in the most brutal days of the conflict when the regime used what were commonly called surrender or starve tactics, where they would besiege opposition held areas and refuse to allow assistance to pass. So sadly, there's a long record of this, and that is why there's so much opposition to this notion of cross-line assistance that passes through Damascus. We also know that the regime has been very adept now at instrumentalizing and co-opting assistance. It is very open about rewarding areas that are loyal to it while punishing areas that were formerly opposition held areas. And we've also seen, I remember when I was at AID, issues of the regime elements interfering with assistance convoys and, searching trucks and taking off some of the assistance. So unfortunately, there is this long history. There are clear problems and challenges that are going to have to be addressed because the Assad regime in no way, shape, or form respects the principles of humanitarian assistance, which is really founded on the impartial provision of aid that's based solely on need. That said, I still think that the idea, as I alluded to before, of a deal that looks at access for access, and that frankly may be an opening to really work very, very hard, the various donors, to begin to improve on these issues that I've laid out that are associated with cross-line assistance, could be very important going forward.
Charles, if the Bab al-Hawa crossing is closed, are there any other workarounds above and beyond going through Damascus?
Short answer is, in theory, yes, but in reality or in practice, almost certainly no. As Jim, I think, alluded to just a few minutes ago, the idea of a non-UN facilitated cross-border effort through Turkish territory into northern Syria is essentially impractical, in large part because Turkey has exerted an enormous pressure on foreign NGOs operating on its soil. And in the past, it has essentially severed INGO access to Turkish territory and then into Syria, as if those INGOs are involved in providing humanitarian assistance to areas controlled by the SDF and the Kurdish communities there. So for a whole variety of complicated reasons, mostly linked to those kind of geopolitical calculations, I think it's very unlikely we could ever go back to the situation we had before 2014, before the UN negotiated this unusual cross-border mandate. And so unfortunately, we really do only have these two options, or this one option on the table, which is the UN cross-border mechanism. And as everyone here on this podcast and essentially everyone else who works on this issue has said, Crossline just isn't in any form a possible alternative to that.
We've covered a lot of ground in our conversation today, but before we wrap up, I'd like to get each of your thoughts briefly on how you think this will play out. Let's start with you, Jim, and then Mona, and then end with you, Charles.
Well, the administration, just like we were a year ago and 18 months ago, is over a barrel on this. You want to keep the people there on the ground. That's important for, first of all, humanitarian reasons. Secondly, for geostrategic reasons, given the importance of Idlib. But there'll be little aid, or it will be difficult for aid flowing unless the Turks are going to pick up a huge burden themselves across the border if you don't have the UN Security Council imprimatur. That blocks any UN aid flowing and aid from other NGOs who either have problems with Turkey, which, as we've just heard, most do, or are also working in Assad areas because they can't do both. So that's the predicament. The question is, how much is the administration willing to put on the table in terms of larger Syria policy to achieve this goal? They've stressed the importance of humanitarian assistance, and they've played down any overall Syria policy in the last 4 months. But it's hard to believe that they really think that way, because Syria is essential to any effort to deal with Iran in the region, now even more important with Raisi as the new president, and also for dealing with Russia in the region. So the administration, once again, it really is in a pickle.
Mona, how about you?
So, I'm guardedly optimistic, which I'm almost hesitating to even say that anytime we talk about Syria or Russia or humanitarian issues. But my own sense is there's a constellation of circumstances that are coming together that suggests that a limited deal structured around this idea of access for access, of maintaining the cross-border crossing, so maintaining that essential access for humanitarian assistance into Idlib, and adding in or encouraging or increasing cross-line assistance, that there could really be some momentum behind that, despite the current, I think, bluster and posturing by Russia today. And I think if we add into it the factor of Turkey's calculus on this, and the ways in which, honestly, for Turkey, I think it's just unthinkable that the crossing be shut down, and that Russia values the partnership with Turkey, and that the US has signaled to Russia that this issue of the humanitarian crossing point is a make or break issue with respect to the prospect for any cooperation with Russia on Syria going forward. I think if you put all of those factors together, then I am guardedly optimistic that, in fact, there may well be some sort of a deal on maintaining the crossing and keeping it open beyond the July 10th expiration.
Charles, you have the last word.
I mean, I think a lot has already been said. I essentially agree with what we've just heard. I think particularly from the standpoint of Turkey and the dynamic that plays vis-a-vis Russia, I find it almost impossible to imagine that cross-border through Bab al-Hawa will be shut altogether. It just, the consequences in terms of the humanitarian situation, but not just that, the likelihood that a total cutoff would almost certainly precipitate eventually a major uptick in hostilities, which I think is a situation that, despite Russia's bluster, it doesn't want to find itself in again, particularly if Turkey ends up having to push back, which I think it would again. I just find it hard to imagine that it's in anybody's interests, including Russia's, to start treading down a path that heads in that direction. So my optimistic head, which admittedly doesn't always come on when we talk about Syria, is that we will see a deal. My fear is that it might be a 6-month rollover, which, as the humanitarian sector has made very clear, is in and of itself a threat to the humanitarian effort because of the sheer enormous amount of resource that has to go into then renegotiating it 6 months down the line. So Hopefully, we'll see more than a 6-month rollover. And then, of course, we should also not forget that the US demand on the table right now isn't just to keep Bab al-Hawa open, it's to reopen the other 2 crossings in northern Syria, one going into Iraq in al-Yacoubian, and one from Aleppo into Turkey at Bab al-Salame. Those, I think that's just an impossible ask. I don't think we're going to see those crossings reopened. Fingers crossed we have the result that we need. But I should also sort of put this in context. Even if we do, the humanitarian demands in Syria are only continuing to rise, and they will only continue to rise, even if cross-border is sustained. And we're already seeing quite worrying signs of the international community not fulfilling their promised levels of humanitarian funding to Syria. So this whole broader issue of the humanitarian crisis is only going to continue, even if, as the best case is, cross-border is sustained.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but Charles, Mona, Jim, thank you all for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.